Welcome back to U.S. History. This is Mr. Rosenleaf coming at you. And today we're going to be talking about the post-war peace. So we just saw the end of the war in Europe. And I did post to Google Classroom an extra little bit about America on the home front during the war. A lot of propaganda posters and some information in there that you should review. But I'm not going to. We're not going to do it in class. It's something you can review by yourselves because it's highly visual. Okay, so we're getting into the post-war peace, and we're talking about, in terms of America, Woodrow Wilson and his impact on this document that's going to become known as the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, so even before the war ended, heck, before America even got involved in the war, Wilson had an idea for the post-war peace. He had a vision of what he wanted things to look like after this huge catastrophic war. And Wilson called his plan the 14 points. It contained a number of things that, for our purposes, we don't need to really get into. But things like ending the entangling alliance systems that helped to start the war, and reduction of armaments, things like that. But the biggest thing that that he wanted was an international organization to prevent wars, to stop conflicts before they start. And this was what Wilson called the League of Nations. And that was one of the 14 points that I think he was most passionate about. So Wilson, in order to ensure that his vision was carried out, he wasn't going to entrust the negotiation of the peace to a subordinate. And so Wilson is going to do something that no American president had ever done prior to this. I think Teddy Roosevelt had gone down to the Panama Canal briefly. But Wilson's going to actually lead the delegation, the American delegation, going to the Paris Peace Conference. And this was a huge deal. I mean, this would involve Wilson being gone from America for months at a go. And to get to and from Europe was still a several-week voyage by sea. So this was serious business. When Wilson arrives, now he's going to make one mistake before he even sets foot out of America, and that is in his delegation going with him to this conference. He does not invite any members of the Republican-led Senate. The Senate is who would have to ultimately ratify whatever treaty Wilson came back with. And Wilson decided not to include any Republicans on his delegation. And that is going to prove to be one of the things that will ultimately sink the Treaty of Versailles in America. Just spoiler alert, America's not going to ratify this bad boy. So anyway, he does not name any top Republicans to his delegation. So Wilson arrives in Paris. He is not interested in monetary gain. He is not interested in gaining territory from this war. But he did want that League of Nations, that community of power that could prevent this kind of a war from ever happening again. So this picture shows Wilson walking in Paris. Next to him is, looking like a walrus, the French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. And next to Clemenceau is the British Prime Minister David Lloyd George. And these three guys are going to represent really kind of the big three of this conference. Right over there, first row. They're going to be kind of the big three of this conference. Now, there was supposed to be a big four. The guy next to Lloyd George in this picture was the Italian Prime Minister, whose name eludes me at the moment. But that never really comes to be. The big three basically shut Italy out, and we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. So yeah, it was really these three guys, and here's just another glamour shot of the big three there. Lloyd George looking a bit like a happy cat, and again Clemenceau looking like a walrus, and frankly Wilson looking pretty bad. Pretty gaunt at this point. But Wilson was really greeted. I mean, when he got to Paris, his 14 points were what the world wanted, the people of the world wanted. But they were not what his allies wanted. They were not what Britain wanted, the government of Britain. They were not what the government of France wanted. Those governments wanted Germany. They wanted to see Germany hurt to the point where they could never, ever, 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 ever do this again. They wanted to punish Germany. They wanted to hurt them just to watch them bleed. It was visceral, especially for the French. The British were sort of neutral in all of this, but they were willing to go along with the French demands that Germany be massively hurt. And Wilson really didn't want that. For one thing, America had huge amounts of money tied up in Germany. Pardon me. For some reason, we lost our... There we go. Huge amounts of money tied up in Germany. And so Wilson was trying to protect that money, and America would invest even more in Germany as the years go by here. But we saw Germany as a huge market for us. But the people really, really liked what Wilson was throwing down with the 14 points. Especially minorities in places like Austria-Hungary, especially minorities in, or I guess the majority in the Arab world. Africa really liked what Wilson was saying. However, Wilson's willingness to actually follow that out for anyone who was not white was pretty minimal. But so anyway, so this is a lovely painting at the at the big hall in Versailles where this conference was happening. Wilson, you see there, kind of center left in the picture. Clemenceau in the middle was the chairman of the entire conference because obviously he was the French prime minister and this was France. Lloyd George there to the other side of Clemenceau. And I think that's Germany there in the foreground with their head bowed, kind of looking at what they're being forced to sign. Okay, so here's a point where once I tell you the questions, why don't you go ahead and, or actually I think these ones were pretty quick, so we'll just do them together. So, what was the name for Wilson's plan for the post-war peace, which he presented in Paris? Very good, that would be the 14 points. What did America seek to gain from the war? So remember, America didn't want land, they didn't want money. They wanted a global community of power to stop future wars. And here's where you can pause. What do you think other nations wanted from the treaty? And do you think Wilson's 14 points will be accepted? So take a pause here. Good job. Some great answers there. I absolutely know it. Okay, so ultimately, after much negotiation, I mean, this takes the better part of a year to fully negotiate, that ultimately the peace is signed, and the European powers, the British, the French, they are going to force some very humiliating stuff on the Germans, making them pay in money, in land, in other ways. They will also take land away from Russia. Russia was technically an allied power, but they were not allowed to sit in this conference. I think they could have an observer, but they were not allowed to say anything because they had signed a separate peace with the Germans. And so the delegations take land away from Russia and give it to Poland, actually, so that Poland would have an actual country. They take land away from Germany, they take land away from Russia to make Poland, among other countries. But Wilson's 14 points are mostly rejected. The only thing that he is able to hang on to of all of his idealism was the League of Nations. That was kind of the hill that he was going to die on. And he was willing to throw out the baby in the bathwater, everything else, to get the League of Nations. In the League Charter, one of the provisions is that an attack on one League nation is an attack on all of the League. This is incredibly controversial. We will revisit this when we get back to the United States, and we will keep revisiting it really up until World War II. This will be one of the huge planks that the Senate uses to kill this treaty in America. Okay, so when they were negotiating the League of Nations, Japan was at this conference. Japan was part of the victorious alliance. Japan had actually even sent ships into the Mediterranean. I mean, imagine that, sailing all the way from Japan to, I mean, I'm sure they used the Suez Canal, but still, that's still a long, very long voyage for Japanese ships. And so Japan had sent ships into the Mediterranean, so they were and they had also been active in the Pacific. Germany had colonial possessions in the Pacific, and so they were active in sort of occupying those as well. So Japan was very much part of the victors, and when they show up, they decide to propose something for the League of Nations. Now, this is some of the Japanese delegation and some of their leadership, I think probably before heading out. But here's what they propose. This is the proposal. It's a proposal for racial equality, and it says the following: the equality of nations being a basic principle of the League of Nations. The high contracting parties agree to accord as soon as possible to all alien nationals of states, members of the League, equal and just treatment in every respect, making no distinction either in law or in fact on account of their race or nationality. I have to tell you, this was greeted with great praise from a number of delegations at this conference. Those representing these new countries, these areas that were not part of the big empires, they greeted this very warmly. But this was a non-starter amongst countries like Great Britain, amongst countries like France, amongst the United States. This was greeted very coldly by those areas and by their colonial possessions that were represented there. So when the vote came to happen, though, 11 of the 17 countries who were a part of this committee, this League of Nations committee, they agreed to it. They said, yes, absolutely. So it passed, right? Well, not so much. The chairman of that committee was one Woodrow Wilson of the United States, President of the United States. And Wilson ruled that this provision, just this provision, no other provisions, but this provision had to be adopted with unanimity. Had to be unanimous. The Japanese strongly protested. They're like, wait a minute, what the heck? That's not right. We've never had to have unanimity on anything else. And Wilson said, the chair has ruled that the motions failed. So the Japanese they leave this conference very disappointed, very angry. Their racial equality provision has failed. They did not receive, they had been promised basically all of Germany's Asian territories, and they only got basically a skiff of them. They were given a part of China, to which China, which was also part of the winning coalition, went, what? Wait a minute. Why did they get part of us? So, yeah, China and Russia are actually the two allied countries that lose territory in this whole thing. And that's like a whole nother thing. But, yeah, so they have to give back most of Germany's colonies in the Pacific, which end up going to the British and the French. So the British and the French actually expand their empires, and we'll see more of that. And the Japanese, who had been very faithful in their prosecution of this war in the Pacific, really don't get what they were promised. They did get the Shandong region of China, but again, China goes, well, that's not right. No, we don't agree to that. And we're going to see how they treat their Chinese possessions coming up when we start talking about World War II. Now, Italy's another one. Italy had been a faithful ally. Like the Allies had convinced Italy to switch sides. They were not going to participate, and they were kind of cozied up to the Germans, and the Allies got them to change. And Italy had been promised a bunch of territory, South Tyrol, the Dalmatian coast, and they had also had their eyes set on other parts of Austria-Hungary, and they got barely anything. And Italy had lost 600,000 men in the war. And when they came to the peace conference, they were supposed to be part of the big dogs, and they were put to the side. Basically, the British and the French had the United States, and they weren't interested in talking to Italy about much of anything. So the Italian prime minister actually leaves. He leaves his underlings to finish up the negotiations. He's like, this isn't worth my time. This doesn't work, and we're not getting what we wanted. And then, fast forward to the 1920s, and Italy hooks up with a strongman leader that says, if we're not going to be given what we had desired in peacetime, then we're going to make war to get it. So Italy also impacted by this, leading to not so good things. So real quick, and go ahead and pause and think about why was Japan dissatisfied with the Treaty of Versailles? Give some specifics. And why was Italy mad about the treaty? So take a second and talk about it. Great job. That sounded fantastic. Lots of good discussion going on there. Okay, so next up, the Middle East. So a couple of things going on here. So the Ottoman Empire is going to be broken up, and there is a revolution in Turkey that brings to Turkey a secular government that is kind of still around today. At least the idea of it being secular, although the current leader of Turkey is skewing Turkey much more toward an Islamic form of government. But so that's going on in what we think of today as Turkey, or I think they now want to be called Turkey. So that's happening. And then in addition, you have the Arab countries down in, or the Arab world, so down in what we think of as Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, even Egypt. The people there had been urged to rebel. So the British had talked to the emir of Mecca, a gentleman by the name of Sharif Hussein bin Ali. And he had agreed, and the British had said, if you do this for us, we're going to guarantee you a, a big Arabic country. You can have your own Arabic country. And basically, they promised them the entire Middle East. And he gets his kids involved in this, and they lead attacks on the Ottomans, and it's a really big deal. This is a huge uprising, and it's called the Arab Revolt. And in the end, when the Ottomans quit, the British crack down on this Arab revolt. They send their troops in to put down this Arab revolt. And in the end, they end up dividing all of this country. Winston Churchill, at a separate conference, sits down and basically takes a magic marker to the Middle East and goes, how about this? And, they divide up into these countries that make no logical sense. In the country of Iraq, for example, they put together three ethnic and religious groups that hate each other. You have the Kurds in the north who just want their own country because there are Kurds in the south of Turkey as well, and they just want their own country, but they can't have that. So the Kurds are divided up. And the Kurds in Iraq are put together with Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. And the Sunnis and the Shias hate each other too. So, yeah, they all hate each other, and they all have to occupy one country. The only thing that has ever brought the country together is strongman dictatorship. And they end up getting that in the 1980s when a guy named Saddam Hussein comes to power. So Iraq is a SH show. Jordan, Syria, same way, lots of problems there. And there's also a country called Palestine, and Britain's going to make an agreement with the Zionist movement, which was this Jewish nationalist movement, to allow their followers to start moving into Palestine. And the Palestinians are going, what now? Excuse me? And that's going to end up leading to the formation of Israel after World War II, and that's going to lead to the wiping out of Palestine shortly thereafter. So, the Middle East is a powder keg of awfulness, largely because the start of it was the Treaty of Versailles and the treaties that come after that, ending World War I. Oh, and the British and the French have protectorship over Jordan, Iraq, and Syria. So they're basically calling the shots in the early days. They will eventually get independence, but yeah. So if you want to know why the Middle East doesn't trust the West, this would be a really key reason why. And then we get to Europe. So Europe has a bunch of new countries now. Obviously you see Poland there. Notice too that Germany, and we'll talk about this in a minute, there's a little bit of Germany, kind of Poland's holding on to it. That is known as East Prussia, and those that came up with the Treaty of Versailles decided to draw the map that way so that Poland would have a route to the sea, and that divides up Germany. And Prussia is considered to be like the most militaristic part of Germany. And so they basically are separating a good chunk of Prussia off from the rest of the country. Notice now there is a Czechoslovakia. It just says Czech, but that's just because Czechoslovakia is too long for that map. So the Czechs and the Slovaks are shoehorned into that weird little looking country. Austria is now a separate country. Hungary is a separate country. Romania is there. Bulgaria is there. And country called Yugoslavia that we're not really going to have time to talk about today, but wait until we get to the 90s. And that's going to become a powder keg of awfulness. And again, it took a strongman leader to make them all get together. And that comes along shortly, I think during World War II. A guy by the name of Marshal Tito will basically hold that country together with his spirit. And when he dies, everything falls apart. So, yeah. So these are the new countries of Europe, carved up mostly from Austria-Hungary, but also again from Russia, from part of Germany. Lots of change happening in Europe on this map. 9 new nations formed from Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. And one of the problems with some of these is that this is going to trap certain groups inside countries they maybe don't want to be a part of. There's a big German population in Czechoslovakia, for example. There's big German populations in Poland. There's Russian population in Poland. So this was hardly ideal. Again, this was a lot of sitting down and with a magic marker and kind of drawing borders. They were a little more thoughtfully drawn than in the Middle East, but not much. And a lot of these nations were meant to serve as a buffer between Russia and Europe because Russia was now communist and communism. Okay, so now we get to Germany. Germany is basically going to have the worst part of this. So Germany has to admit sole responsibility for the war. They have to say, we started the war, which we know is not true. They were just jumping in to help Austria-Hungary, but the problem is Austria-Hungary doesn't exist anymore. So, yeah, that's a problem. Germany had to pay $55 billion in reparations, and that's in, 1919 money. That at that time, that's like saying you owe us 55 gibbity dollars. It's like it didn't even compute. Germany will lose Alsace-Lorraine, which was the territory I was searching for the other day and couldn't think of. And that was this little disputed territory between France and Germany. Germany had gotten it after the Napoleonic Wars, and now France had it back. And Germany, obviously, as we saw on the map, divided. East Prussia no longer contiguous. Germany loses all of its colonial possessions, almost all of them taken over by the British and the French. In Asia, in Africa, basically the British and the French get everything, much again to Japan's chagrin. So that was what was going on. The $55 billion was too much for Germany ever to pay. I think they maybe just... they still made them pay it after World War II, and I think they maybe just paid it off a few years ago. So that was what was happening with Germany. And here's a cartoon showing the reparations, $55 billion again in Germany, basically under this giant weight. And the London Times reporting that Germany will sign. Basically, they had the option of signing or going back to war. And the Allies were prepared to invade Germany and basically make them sign. So Germany really didn't have much of a choice. They didn't get to negotiate terms. They were set before them, and basically Allies said, sign or go back to war. We're not negotiating. And this cartoon kind of shows, so peace terms, and there's Germany being held by the British Empire, the French, America, Italy, Japan, and basically forced to sign. Got to swallow it whether you like it or not. I do think the cartoon versions of Wilson, Clemenceau, and Lloyd George are particularly adorable. And this is just another cartoon. You get the gist of this one, I think. Okay, so real quick, why don't you pause, and how were the promises broken in the Arab world in the post-war peace, and how was Germany humiliated by the treaty? So take a second and discuss those. Great job. Some awesome responses there. I know you got this. Okay, so America will not ratify this treaty. So Wilson comes back. The Treaty of Versailles was signed on June 28, 1919, by the way, 5 years from the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And the Senate gets a hold of this, and lots of reservations. And remember, the Republican Party controlled the Senate. Wilson was a Democrat, and he had negotiated this thing without any Republicans present. And so the Republicans are going to tear this thing to shreds. They were apprehensive that the United States might be compelled to institute economic sanctions over a country we don't want to economically sanction, or even go to war if it joined the League, because an attack on one League nation was an attack on all of them, even though there were provisions put in place that countries could opt out of this stuff if they really objected. But the Senate either didn't read that far in the treaty or didn't care, and they were not going to pass this thing. So Wilson's going to take his case to the American people. He's going to go barnstorming across the country, a railroad campaign. He speaks out of the back of the railroad cars, and he goes into towns and speaks in churches and things like that, and urging people to contact their senators. Please contact your senators. Please urge them to pass the League of Nations. Please urge them to pass the Treaty of Versailles, which would institute the League of Nations. So while he's doing this, though, September 25th, 1919, he collapses in Pueblo, Colorado. And when his wife orders the train to return him to Washington. And on October 2nd, 1919, so they get back to Washington a couple days later, he is convalescing in his room. And October 2nd, 1919, Wilson suffers an absolutely debilitating stroke. He is paralyzed on his left side. He is incapacitated for the rest of his life. It is believed that his wife, Edith, who is actually his second wife, his first wife died during his first term. He met this young woman, Edith Galt, courted her, dated her, married her. And so they had not been married that long when Woodrow has this massive stroke. And she will basically take paperwork. So the cabinet will bring her things, and his staff will bring her things, and she'll say, okay, I'll get the president to sign these. And she goes into the bedroom, closes the doors, and when she emerges, he's signed them. But the handwriting looks starkly different. Now, that could be the stroke. That could be that Edith Wilson is signing things for her husband. We will never know. But it is believed that Edith Wilson was functionally the first female president of the United States. Functionally, not officially, just functionally. So this is kind of what Wilson does with the treaty, and unfortunately, he was the one that really wanted it signed, and he was not there to get Congress to do it. So, unfortunately, that's not going to work out. And the Senate really treats it like it's an absolute disease. So the Senate rejects it 3 times. And ultimately, and here's a cartoon with the Senate objecting to our union to foreign entanglements. Ultimately, the United States will pass a formal end to hostilities, but we will not pass the Treaty of Versailles. It is passed after Wilson leaves office because Wilson vetoes this proposal several times, even though he's not really able to do that. America is now a creditor nation. People owe us money. That ain't never happening again. European countries owe us $11.5 billion. The American people, though, start to turn inward. They see that this Treaty of Versailles, nothing really changed. The big empires are still big empires. Some of them, splintered apart, but most of their land went to the other big empires. We were talking about making the world safe for democracy, and so many people are still without democracy, although we didn't care so much if they weren't white. But so we started to support a more isolationist foreign policy, even though America was probably it was on the upswing in terms of global power. America could have been a superpower in the 20s if it had wanted to, but America turned inward. They decided not to pursue that. The government canceled war contracts when the soldiers returned home, so they didn't need to make more bullets or anything like that. In fact, they were dumping ammunition into the harbors as the ships came back, and so the economy is going to take a hit because the government's no longer paying for a bunch of production. There will be a surge in the 20s, but that will end up petering out. We'll talk about that later. And a post-war gloom descends on the country. Nothing had changed. The sacrifices that these soldiers had made, even though we hadn't sacrificed that much, seemed to be in vain. And so America in the 20s, it was this decade of great exuberance, but it was also this decade of severe sadness. And you can kind of see that in the writing and the literature and the art, and we'll talk about that when we get into the 20s. Okay, so in your reflection document for today, I want you to answer 3 things. Number 1, what were Britain and France's goals in the Treaty of Versailles? What did they want? And how did this conflict with what the United States want, with the statements that Wilson had made? How did these things jive? How did they not jive? Right? How did the treaty impact Japan, Italy, Germany? And what was the impact on the Middle East? So what happened there? And why did the United States not ratify the Treaty of Versailles? So those are the 3 big points I want you to write about. At least a couple sentences for each one. I mean, come on. You're juniors in high school now. You can write a couple sentences for a question. It's not the end of the world. Okay, so we will end there. If we need to pause right here so people can get those questions down, Ms. Crawford, please do so. And I will see you guys tomorrow. Thank you.